Andy Warhol once said that in the future, we're all going to be world famous for 15 minutes. Well, you're all going to be famous longer than that because the final segment of our conference will be broadcasted live on LinkedIn. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow, Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore, and Dr. Hsien-Hsien Lei, CEO of AmCham Singapore, to the stage for this very special episode of America Through the Eyes of Kishore.
Wow, look at this full house. I think they may have come to see Tamer and Hans, but actually the truth is they came for you, Prof. For Mr. Kishore Mahbubani, can we have a round of applause that he's here with us today? And not only that, as all of you know, Jessica just shared that we are broadcasting for the first time a session like this on LinkedIn Live. We have been doing this series, America Through the Eyes of, for, about a few months already. And it started because, well, yes, it is a US presidential election year, and many people love to tell me their opinion of the United States. And as the CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce, I can take it. We are a nonpartisan, neutral organization, and so people feel very free to share their opinions with me about what they think the United States should fix and what they admire, not so often, about the United States. And I'm like, hey, if you want to tell me your opinion, let's make this into a show. So as you know, we've had a number of different luminaries share their opinions, America through the eyes of various folks. And today we will have America through the eyes of Professor Kishore Mahbubani. And Professor Kishore Mahbubani is not short of opinion. So I'm actually kind of hoping you will not hold back, even though I am Asian American. So I want to start that off. I am Asian American. And so I sometimes have conflicted feelings when I read or hear you talk about the United States. Because on the one hand, I'm really, really proud that you believe that Asians and Asia can do so well, and that there's so much potential here in Singapore and in the region. But on the other hand, I am very American in the sense that my family immigrated to the United States when I was 7 years old. And I truly believe, we were from Taiwan, and I truly believe that my family, my sister and I, would not have had the opportunities that we have had growing up in the United States if we had stayed in Taiwan. I honestly believe that the education that we received and the opportunities that we've had happened because my parents chose to take the risk to go to the United States. And so on that front, we'll have this conversation about America, and I really want to encourage you, Prof, to not hold back, and I promise I can take it. I will not cry. And as many of you know, Professor Mahbubani recently released his memoirs, which was officially on August 7th. And I know some of you have already purchased copies, and there will be, I believe there are more copies outside, and Prof will stay afterwards to sign copies. But as I read the book, I read it over the weekend, and I was so incredibly touched because your dedication to your family, your mother, your dedication to your country, Singapore, was so evident throughout every page of the book. And I just felt so moved by that. And I want to thank you for sharing your story, first of all. So a round of applause for Professor for having shared his very intimate life story, because I mean, when you read it, you'll know what I mean. So I'm just going to open up the conversation by asking you, as you were writing your memoirs, did you find that your opinions or your perspective started to change a little bit because you were reflecting on what has happened to you? Your relationship with the United States is actually quite deep and varied over the years, and you shared quite openly about that as well. We'll go into more of the details later, but I'm just wondering about the process and how you felt as you wrote your memoirs.
First of all, thank you, Hsien-Hsien, for having me here. It's such a pleasure. I see many old friends in this room. Good to get together with you, and I'll try to heed your advice and not hold back. But I want to emphasize at the same time that if the country in which I've spent the most years of my life, obviously, is Singapore, the second country in which I've spent the most years of my life is the United States of America. I'm trying to work out, I've either spent 15 or 16 years altogether in the US, 2.5 years in Washington, DC, 10.5 years in New York, twice as Singapore's ambassador to UN, 1 year in Harvard as a visiting fellow. And then I've gone back countless times to spend times at so many different universities in the United States. So in a sense, clearly United States is a country, second country in which I've interacted with the most after Singapore. And I have, I must say, a tremendous number of friends in the US. I mean, it's just amazing. Every time I go back, there was always such pleasure catching up. And I'm actually going to go back and, you mentioned my book. After launching it in Singapore, KL, and Hong Kong, I'm going to launch it in New York at Asia Society and at Harvard University. And Harvard University has organized a whole day program for me to meet so many different people. So it is, for me, like it's going back to the United States in some ways, almost like, also like going back home to meet so many friends.
So as you were writing, there's so many parts of the book that I highlighted, and I guess, one of the earliest things one of the first things that we've been talking about during this conference continuously through the 2 days has been about trade. And as you might be aware, earlier today we had Ralph Ives and Tommy Koh with us talking about the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. And so I suppose just to connect what we've been talking about over the 2 days and what the conversation we had earlier today, in the process of writing your book and reflecting upon the interactions that you've had with certain US leaders in thinking about free trade, what is your opinion on how successful the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement has been over the last 20 years, since we're celebrating the 20th anniversary today?
Well, I'm glad you had the real expert, Tommy Koh, in this room, because Tommy, as you know, negotiated the US-Singapore FTA. But I'm going to take a sort of a larger philosophical view of the trade issue, because one of the highlights in my life was that I accompanied Mr. Lee Kuan Yew when he addressed a joint session of Congress. That's the only time when a leader of Singapore has been invited to address the joint session of Congress, and I felt very proud to be there in the room, because we had some difficulty nailing down whether or not it would happen or not happen. So since I was ambassador to the UN, and since George Shultz, the Secretary of State, was going to come to New York for the UNGA, I got instruction from the Singapore government saying, please try and find a way of going straight for George Shultz and asking him, can you let us know whether the joint session is on? And George Shultz said to me, I guarantee you it'll be done. So I conveyed the message that the joint session speech would happen. Now, the reason I mentioned that is that one of the most powerful speeches that Lee Kuan Yew ever gave was a speech that he gave to the joint session in Congress, and it was all about trade. And it was, at the end of the day, it was a love letter from Mr. Lee Kuan Yew to the United States of America saying, thank you very much for telling us about the principles of free trade. Thank you very much for telling us to open up our economies. And thank you very much for stimulating this tremendous growth in East Asia, right? So that's 1986 or 87. You fast forward almost 40 years. And I think if Mr. Lee Kuan Yew were alive today, he would have great difficulty giving the same speech on trade. Because I have many good friends in the US, and there's a tremendous backlash against free trade in the United States. And the paradoxical moment, the great paradox about the moment that we are living in today is that the countries that are succeeding in the world are succeeding because their leaders learn some brilliant lessons on the importance of free trade from American universities. So they take all their learning from American universities, they're applying it, and they're doing well, they're thriving. And in the previous session, you already saw, Taimur talking about the excitement in Malaysia. And so what's driving that? American ideas. Again, about opening up trade and so on and so forth. So the paradox is that while most of Asia is embracing these ideas of free trade, United States sadly is walking away from it. And the reality is that, for example, if you take the Trans-Pacific Partnership, That was very much something that was designed to ensure that the United States had a long-term vested interest in staying in this region. There were sound geopolitical trade reasons for the CPP, but then boom, United States decided to leave. And I think that's very sad. And if there's anything we can do, I know it's going to be very difficult. I'm extremely aware of the political complexity within the United States today. It'd be extremely difficult to get any presidential candidate to say, hey, if you vote for me, I'll join CPP. That's a vote loser, right? We know that. So the question, therefore, for us in Asia is, against this political backdrop, where there's incredible backlash against trade in the US, how do we ensure that the United States remains engaged in this region?
Well, we are down in the countdown to the presidential elections in November. And one thing is certain, we're going to have a new administration. However, one of the candidates we kind of know. The other one is kind of new, but it's not all, nobody's really new, are they? What advice or what would you say to whichever the new administration comes to be? And we're not in the game of doing predictions, although we did try to get Deputy Chief of Mission Casey Mays to predict the election earlier. He didn't play, so I think he's very smart. So I'm not going to ask you to predict who's going to win, but I would like to understand what advice you would give to whichever administration is elected on what the potential path to reinvigorating trade in the region might be, if they were even a little bit open to it.
Well, you're right. It's impossible to make predictions. I remember 2016 very well. I remember the US Embassy organized a gala event in some big hotel. I don't know whether it was this hotel or some other hotel, some other place, probably near Suntec City, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And as I walk into this room as big as this, normally in the elections, results are coming out, everybody's very happy. There was doom and gloom in the room. So I kept going around saying, what's going on? Why is everyone looking so gloomy? They said, well, it looks as though Trump is going to win. And it was a big shock, huge shock. And I know that my friends, obviously, I'm sort of indicating where most of my friends are, were very, very disappointed. And certainly Kirk Wagner was the ambassador then, was also very disappointed. So I think we have to, in this part of the world, acknowledge the reality that Donald Trump may win. I mean, you have to prepare for that. It'd be irresponsible not to prepare for it. Okay? Then the question is, what do we do? How do we handle it? And at the end of the day, I do believe that you have to appeal to long-term national self-interest. At the end, I may sound very cynical, but geopolitics is a very cold, cruel game. It's not about being nice. It's about appealing to hard, core, long-term interests. And at the end of the day, the United States has got to assess whether its presence in East Asia is a major asset for America's long-term interests. And remember that what's unique about Southeast Asia, and seriously, there are not many other parts of the world can replicate this. There are huge reservoirs of goodwill towards the United States in Southeast Asia. It's partly the Cold War history. ASEAN is a pro-American creation, denounced by Russia and China, Soviet Union and China when it was created. And there's a long history of happy engagement between the United States and Southeast Asia. But the sad part is this: most Americans are not even aware that Southeast Asia exists. And most Americans are certainly not aware that there are huge pools of reservoir goodwill towards the United States in this region. So you have a precious asset here that can go to waste. And similarly, even within East Asia, and certainly in Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, there's a lot of goodwill towards the United States. But at the end of the day, if you want to preserve that, it requires long-term commitment. It cannot go up and down on the basis of election cycles. And so I hope that you can create a constituency within the United States, a bipartisan constituency that says, hey, American presence in this region is important and we must be part of it. And of course, at the end of the day, frankly also, I'm sure we're going to discuss it at some point in time, how you manage China is equally important, right? As you can see from these countries in this region, they want to be friends with the United States and they want to be friends with China. Okay, and they have to be. Because if the United States is going to be around for 100 years, China will be around 1,000 years. So Southeast Asians dealt with China 1,000 years ago. They have to deal with China 1,000 years from now. So they have to preserve those links also. So managing that very delicate change requires a certain degree of political sophistication within Washington, D.C., which frankly, as of now, doesn't exist yet. So that's what we need to build in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I'm going to bridge over to the China thing in a second, but I do want to ask our members in the audience. For AmCham members, we represent a great diversity of American companies and American business interests, and this is where our job would be to carry the message of what's happening in Southeast Asia, the complexity of the region, the opportunities here, back to the United States. And every time you get a chance to do that with your corporate headquarters, with people that you meet who are coming through, I highly encourage you to do so. And if you're not comfortable doing it, I'll do it for you. So that's something that I do hope you take very seriously, because we do need to help people understand what is Southeast Asia. I think they know what Singapore is now, and we all know crazy rich Asians, but generally Singapore's profile has risen. But Southeast Asia, they still think of it as a block of countries without realizing how incredibly different Indonesia is from Vietnam, et cetera. So please, let's all work together to communicate that back home to the United States. On the China one, I'm going to quote a little bit of your book, because I did make a bunch of highlights. But one which I thought was super interesting was when you said, for great powers such as the United States, their influence doesn't depend on the quality and ability of their ambassadors. Power speaks more eloquently than personality in generating influence. And I actually thought, given that you mentioned China, when I read that, I thought, okay, great powers such as the United States. And I thought, well, same for China, right? Can you talk a little bit more about the fact that power speaks more and has more influence than individuals or individual personalities? Because it doesn't really feel like that right now when you have leaders of these huge countries who are such strong personalities that it almost rides out any kind of policy conversation.
Well, I can tell you that, I was an ambassador for many years. And although I was never actually what I call a bilateral ambassador, although I was head of mission in Cambodia in 73, 74, when the war was taking place. And that's when I learned a lot about geopolitics, because every day the city would be shelled. And then I realized, hey, war is a serious business. But I can tell you, once you become an ambassador and you arrive at a capital, one of the first questions you ask yourself is, who's the most important ambassador in this capital? Because there's a hierarchy among ambassadors, clearly. And quite often, the ambassador of a neighboring country would be very important, because they would have to understand their neighbor very well, clearly. But also, you also realize that whoever the great power of the day, also that ambassador will be very, very important. And you give a concrete example. Throughout the Cold War, if you went to Bangkok, right, very clearly the most powerful ambassador in Bangkok by far was the American ambassador, right? Because, Thailand was a treaty ally, Thailand was a very important staging post for operations in Indochina, and there had always been a certain degree of closeness between the Thai establishment and the American establishment. So the American ambassador, number one, and frankly, in those days, the Chinese ambassador was not very consequential. I mean, important, but not that consequential. But today, I think if you go to Thailand and you ask yourself which ambassador is more important, it would depend also on which country does, for example, does Thailand do more trade with, United States or China? And the answer is China. And which country is engaged in new projects in China, right? Again, in Thailand. And I suspect the answer again is China. So progressively you find that the standing of the Chinese ambassador is slowly going up, and the relative standing of the US ambassador is going down. And also in terms of visits, for example, Chinese leaders have more visits in Thailand than American leaders do. In fact, I can tell you this, one American diplomat based in Southeast Asia one day called me up and said, Kishore, help me. This was in a year when there was another crisis in the Middle East, and the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, was debating whether or not to come for an ASEAN meeting. And this American diplomat said, Kishore, help me persuade Condi, she must come for the ASEAN meeting, you know. So that's the kind of consistency of attention that China gives to Southeast Asia then becomes a plus, whereas the inconsistency of the United States becomes a minus, and then that affects the ranking of ambassadors too. So it is a reality, but it keeps changing all the time. It's dynamic. So for example, let's say if the United States decides to mount a major ASEAN initiative, which to some extent Joe Biden tried to do by inviting the ASEAN ambassadors to the US and so on and so forth. Let's say if the United States proposes a new working arrangement with ASEAN, then things can change. But at the end of the day, it's partly a reflection of your power and your commitment to the region, and not personality. And that's a reality of international relations.
Well, speaking of how the United States ambassadors are perceived outside of, in various countries around the world, and even just the different ambassadors and the shifting of importance, there's something else you wrote in the book that I thought was, when I read it, I thought, ouch. And we do have some folks from the U.S. Foreign Service in the room, so you all brace yourself if you haven't read this already. But in the book, Professor Mahbubani wrote, American Foreign Service is demoralized and much less effective. Something has clearly gone wrong. And I've only taken 2 sentences out of about 8 to 10 sentences in that vein. And just out of curiosity, because we talked about the importance of having ambassadors be engaged in the country that they're in, and we do have also other ambassadors in the room, including my good friend, Ambassador McGrath from Ireland. You know, this idea that the Foreign Service in the United States, and possibly you can help us compare and contrast a little bit with other countries' Foreign Service. Are we, as Americans, do we really have a Foreign Service that is demoralized and clearly gone wrong?
Well, I mean, as you know, I've dealt with American diplomats from the time I joined the Foreign Ministry in 1971, so that's about 53 years. And I can tell you, when I was in Cambodia, I became very good friends with my American counterparts there, and they were brilliant diplomats. Some of them got awards from the State Department, like Tim Carney did, and Tom Anders, and then when I went to Kuala Lumpur, my next posting, I had an extremely close relationship with Ambassador Miller, and then with Frank Bennett and another diplomat whose name will come to me in a second. But I can tell you that, for example, some of you may know I'm married to a girl born in New Jersey called Anne Markey. The person who introduced me to Anne Markey was Frank Bennett, an American diplomat. So, you know, I had very close ties with them. But at that time, you know, the American diplomats were engaged, happy, confident about their future in their service. Quite a few of them would advance and become ambassadors. Now this is data that is available by Google. Just ask yourself a simple Google question. How many ambassadorial appointments in the US Foreign Service had political appointees, and how many had career Foreign Service officers? If I'm not mistaken, don't hold me to this, the long-term ratio used to be about 70% for career Foreign Service officers. And that's very important, because when you join the Foreign Service, your aspiration is to become an ambassador, right? You want to reach the top. And so if you have a large pool of ambassadors to choose from, your statistical odds of becoming an ambassador are much higher, because only 30% are political appointees. Don't hold me to this, but I think now the ratio is reverse. Now it's 70% political and 30%. Please Google and check this, okay? This is, let me know. But it's moving in that direction. So as a result of it, if you join the State Department, sadly, this is true. If you are lucky, you can become ambassador to Mali, to Congo, to Guinea-Bissau, but London, Paris, Tokyo, Seoul, Singapore, you name all the major capitals, it's all political appointees. And of course, it is good that you have political appointees. I'm not saying it's bad. In fact, Singapore appreciates having political appointees, because political appointees gives us access to the White House. So we like having political appointees. I'm not saying go towards zero political appointees. That would be wrong. But at the same time, you must create enough opportunities for your career Foreign Service officers to also succeed and do well. And I think some of the ones who became, there's a special term you have in the State Department, I think it's a career ambassador post. Those posts are very important as aspirational posts for diplomats rising up the ladder. And I met more successful diplomats like Tom Pickering, for example, who's a legend, right? He's a good friend of mine. And he's a career Foreign Service officer. But he could rise to the very top, right? Now that's what you need to create also within the Foreign Service, and which is what we have done, for example, in the Singapore Foreign Service. We used to have lots of political appointees too, but now they're almost all career-based ambassadors.
Right, thank you so much for that candid assessment. There's always room for improvement, right? So I wouldn't feel too bad about it, but it's something to think about, especially as we represent ourselves on the foreign stage. I'm about to open this up to the floor, and I think I just want to close off with something I read that I think is worthwhile for us to remember, because there are many leaders in the audience who are currently working in public affairs, folks who are, we have some students in the audience too, who are thinking about a career in public service. And you mentioned that as you were thinking about it for the LKY School of Public Policy and working with a consulting firm, actually I should just say the name because they're a member too, McKinsey, the 4 areas you thought were important were economics, politics, leadership, and management, which is kind of an interesting mix for a School of Public Policy to educate its leaders on. Before we transition to opening up to questions, would you like to comment on how you envision the leaders of tomorrow in public service?
Well, I mean, one of the saddest things about our world today, and I got to be also very careful here, is that the quality of the quality of the leaders of some of the major countries in the world is deteriorating. This is a very serious problem we have in the world today. And of course, I mean, this I can say openly because I've said so publicly many times. The UK has traditionally produced some of the greatest leaders in the world. Winston Churchill clearly was one of them. I mean, Margaret Thatcher was another. I can tell you, when Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was stepping down in 1990, I accompanied him on his farewell tour of Europe. So we met Margaret Thatcher in London. Incredibly impressive woman. When we were having dinner at number 10 Downing Street, she stood up and without any notes, nothing in front of her, gave a wonderfully beautiful, eloquent speech about what a great man Lee Kuan Yew is and what he has done. Then Lee Kuan Yew stood up equally spontaneously and responded. So these were two great leaders interacting with each other, you know. Similarly, when he went to Paris, Francois Mitterrand came to the door of Élysée Palace to receive him, which is a breach of protocol because he's head of state. Lee Kuan Yew is only head of government, head of state coming to receive head of government at the entrance. Very unusual. And then when he went to Germany, we met Helmut Kohl, another impressive, thoughtful leader. But you know, now in the UK, for example, you've gone from Margaret Thatcher to Boris Johnson. I mean, he's a joker. I'm not exaggerating. He's just a complete joker. He's actually, history will regard him very unkindly because he destroyed his country by engineering Brexit. Brexit is by any reasonable calculation a disaster for the UK, and Boris Johnson lied his way in the campaign for Brexit. And then after this joker left, he was succeeded by a joke, Liz Truss. She didn't last as long as the head of lettuce, as they say, you know. I mean, so how can a country like UK go from, you know, Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, to Boris Johnson, Liz Truss? But it's not about personalities. There's a structural game here. Politics is becoming more difficult. And you really got to have, it's very difficult to find people who are, on the other hand, very ethical, you know, very committed to doing the right thing, and yet are cunning enough to succeed in the field of politics. Because politics is not easy. If you're not shrewd, if you're not cunning, if you're not ruthless, forget it. And it's very rare to find people who are both good human beings and also shrewd human beings. And now with politics becoming more difficult, it's harder and harder to get good people into politics, and that leaves the field open to all kinds of populists and others who come in. And sadly, that's going to be one of the structural problems for our world. And it's a common problem that many countries are facing around the world.
Thank you so much for that candid response. Now I think I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions. Oh, first question, right up front, Alice Chu. American. Sorry, just got to out you.
I'm like Hsien-Hsien here. Professor Kishore, hello. I work for Glaukos Corporation. We are a mid-cap medtech company based in Orange County, California. So I just want to provide a short story that will give context into the question. And so there's 900 employees worldwide for our company. There's only 3 or 4 here in Singapore, maybe about 20 in Australia, 20 in Japan. So we are small, right? And but we are a lean and mean machine because in 2 weeks we'll be launching our product in China. And for a small company like us, we are so excited about that, right? As an American company. So as an American, I have to get a visa, right? And so I go to the Chinese visa, I get everything in order, right? And I want to get a 10-year visa. So I applied, and 5 days later, you come and pick up. And I was actually fearful whether they would give it to me. So I go up to the counter 5 days later, and the lady, gives it to me, and she's like, okay, check this. It's a 1-year visa. Oh my God, I was so sad, right? Just 1 year, even though I applied for 10-year. And I said, but I applied for 10-year. And so she said, oh, here it is. I was so thrilled to have this 10-year business visa, right? I even took a photo of it, put it on my Facebook because I was so proud. And you don't understand how many congratulations that I got from my American friends, right? So that just tells you about, the mentality, right, of how US perceives, what's going on out here. So as a small company where a majority of our revenues are in the US, right, we have to fight, right, for this region. And about the opportunities, the growth, right? And so we always say the same thing. 50% of the population or more is based in our region over here. The middle class is growing. So we always need to seek those funds from headquarters. So I would like to hear your opinion that given the November election, right? I don't want to cry, right? With all the good things that are happening for our company out here. I would love to hear, let's just say if the Harris administration or the Trump administration hired you as an advisor for this region, okay? What would you advise them is the biggest opportunity for a positive US-Asia relation?
Oh, thank you. Well, I wish you all the best with your, sales in this region. I can tell you that the demand for products in the healthcare area is going to go by leaps and bounds. People now have the means to, spend more money on their health. And products from the United States, as you know, are extremely successful. In fact, I can tell you one of the smarter investments I've made is in some venture capital firm in California that only does healthcare and is doing very well. So one of my better investments. But on the question of what message I would give to either the Harris or the Trump administration, it's a very simple message. I would say, watch out for the new CIA. And CIA is not the Central Intelligence Agency. CIA is China, India, and ASEAN. Why China, India, and ASEAN? Because the total population of China, India, and ASEAN, if you add up 1.4 plus like 700, it's come to 3.5 billion people. Out of this 3.5 billion people, in the year 2000, only 150 million people were enjoying middle-class living standards. So customers for your products, 150 million out of 3.5 billion. By 2020, in 20 years, that number increased 10 times, from 150 million to 1.5 billion. By 2030, this is World Bank statistics, that number is going to go up to 2.5 to 3 billion. There's nowhere else in the world can you get 2.5 to 3 billion potential customers with disposable income to buy your kind of products. So clearly, it's in the interest of the United States to ensure that it is part of this growth story. And the amazing thing is that the United States has been a part of this great growth story in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, and including in China and India too. So it's a matter of giving priority to these areas. And I would say the one delicate point I'm going to make, it's a bit delicate, excuse me. For whatever reason, since the Cold War ended, so many American administrations have been preoccupied or bogged down by wars and conflicts. Whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's, Iraq and so on and so forth. Maybe the time has come for the United States to press the pause button on conflicts and wars and say, okay, done enough of that. Let me now focus on, engaging the world on the other side of the ledger, focusing on integrating economically with the rising parts of the world economy, and make that the number one priority. Because at the end of the day, I mentioned leadership. Leaders like us only have 24 hours a day. And if you're going to spend 16 to 17 hours worrying about this war going on, that war going on, you don't have the time and energy to focus on your real long-term priorities. And the real long-term priority is to stay engaged with the positive side of the ledger. And on the positive side of the ledger, there are tremendous opportunities in this area. But if you get involved in wars, you get distracted, and you're not part of the growth story. And that will be missing a great opportunity.
So I guess I should not argue with you about the importance of democracy and helping people see the benefits of it. Okay, moving on. Yes, next question, please. Ambassador McGrath.
Hello, I'm Sarah McGrath. I'm the Ambassador of Ireland to Singapore. Just maybe building on, you've spoken a bit about the major powers and their influence. Singapore, like Ireland and like the majority of countries in the world, is a small state. And I'd just be interested in your reflections, maybe especially from your time at the United Nations, on the role of small states in an increasingly divided world and what they can do together.
Well, I think that's a great question. And I must say, there's a lot of brotherly affection within Ireland and Singapore. There's some countries with whom we have good chemistry, and certainly with Ireland we do. And when Singapore served on the UN Security Council, Ireland served on the Security Council for 2 years too. So we got to work very closely with the Irish delegation, and we saw eye to eye on many things. And it's good to have, but as you know, to put it very bluntly, there are effective small states, and sadly, there are ineffective small states, and quite a few of them. Ireland and Singapore belong to the club of effective small states. But even small states, at the end of the day, have to be politically sensitive and aware of what's going on in the world, and then maneuvering ourselves. And I can tell you in my book, my memoirs, Living the Asian Century, I tell some stories about my relationship with my Irish counterpart. And I'll be very frank with you. The first story you will enjoy hearing. The second story you may not enjoy, but it's in the book anyway, so I might as well share it with you. The first story is, when we were serving in the Security Council, the Irish ambassador invited us for dinner. And I came there at the end of a long day, walked in this apartment, and said, "Kishore, you look bushed. What can I offer you?" I said, "Just, Richard, I've had a bad day. Can I have a good scotch?" He glared at me and says, "We only serve Irish whiskey here." I know I had made such a major faux pas in my life. But the second story, which I said is not so pleasant one, is that Richard Ryan used to say to me, "Kishore," once he said, "I hate you." I said, "Why do you hate me?" He says, "Everything I say in the UN Security Council has to be scripted, which is true of most countries." He says, I see you with some bullet points and then you're speaking. I say, "Well, they told me the broad line, and then I say what I'm going to say in favor of the broad line." So one day, Richard Ryan decided to follow our view. He happened to speak after the French ambassador on the question of Iraq. And Jean-David Lavitte is a brilliant French ambassador. So he spoke immediately after Jean-David Lavitte, and Jean-David Lavitte had spoken about the humanitarian situation in Iraq. So Richard Ryan decided to ad-lib 2 words. He said, "Like France," then he carried on, "Ireland supports humanitarian." Within 5 minutes, the US delegate at the back of behind the US ambassador had called the US embassy in Dublin. The US embassy in Dublin called the Foreign Ministry of Ireland. The Foreign Ministry of Ireland called the delegate sitting behind Richard Ryan to ask, why did Richard Ryan say, "like France"? So you can see, I tell you this story, and I tell a story in the book, that small states are carefully monitored by the big states on what we do. So we as small states, therefore, the way we get agency is by working closely with each other. And that's why, as you know, Singapore set up the Forum of Small States. FOSS is called, within the UN, and the New Zealand ambassador was quite funny. He would, in those days, this was after Star Wars movie, he said, "May the FOSS be with you." Not FORCE, FOSS, Forum of Small States. So there's a sense of camaraderie among small states, especially in the UN. It's something that's precious and something that we should preserve.
Hi, I'm Haran Lim. I'm an economist at Moody's Analytics. A little bit of background, I previously used to work under the LQISPP, under your leadership and as a research assistant. And I think many could say that we have always appreciated your insights, as contrarian as they may seem. My question is slightly related to your point about ASEAN and also related to the previous presentation as well. You have mentioned that there is going to be a lot of potential in this market, and I think that's been what we have seen in the previous presentation as well. But what do you think potentially could be some of the geopolitical pitfalls, particularly within ASEAN? And I know that one of your previous books as well, you mentioned that ASEAN could be a potential catalyst for peace. And hence, do you see it as still a positive catalyst for both trade and for peace, or do you see potential pitfalls within ASEAN as well? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. The simple answer is I see both great prospects and I see pitfalls too. And on the prospects front, I want to emphasize to all of you that it's important for you to all understand that ASEAN is a genuine miracle. And that's why I wrote the book called The ASEAN Miracle. Because, you know, there's no other part of the world that is as diverse culturally or civilizationally as ASEAN is, okay? Out of the 700 million people, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, you have Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus, and we have lots of communists also in Southeast Asia. Believe me, you can travel to South America, Africa, Central Asia, Northeast Asia. No other part of the world is as diverse as Southeast Asia is. So it's a remarkable part of the world. And British historians used to describe Southeast Asia as the Balkans of Asia, anticipating that all the big wars will be fought within Southeast Asia. And there were big wars, Vietnam War and so on and so forth. But for 45 years, ASEAN has been at complete peace, and ASEAN has grown dramatically, okay? There's one statistic which you should know so you understand how significant ASEAN's economic growth is. In the year 2000, Japan was the world's second largest economy. In the year 2000, Japan was 8 times bigger than ASEAN, 8 times bigger. Today, Japan is only 1.2, 1.3 times bigger. By 2030, ASEAN will be bigger than Japan. So we have taken in Southeast Asia the most diverse region of planet Earth, which was designed for wars, and we have made it into a zone of peace and prosperity, which is a remarkable achievement. But there are dangers, and the biggest dangers we face clearly is the US-China geopolitical contest. Because if the ASEAN countries are asked to take sides, then that will be a problem, and that would cause problems within ASEAN. I can tell you one of the things that I'm doing in these weeks that is quite interesting is that the president-elect, I can say this publicly, the president-elect of Indonesia, General Prabowo, has asked me to speak to his incoming team. I went 3 times to Jakarta. This morning I did it over Zoom. Then I'll do one more session over Zoom. But when I talk to this incoming team of President Prabowo about the future and what the prospects are, one thing I emphasize to Indonesia is that we in ASEAN, especially Indonesia, should make an effort to keep ASEAN together and not get divided in any way if there is a US-China contest. Because all of us want to be friends with the US and want to be friends with China, and we don't want to take sides. And if we can keep that position, it'll be, but there'll be threats, there'll be challenges coming our way. But at the same time, I must emphasize also that the opportunities in Southeast Asia are also phenomenal. And, you know, there's something very special about a part of the world where at a time when you see, you know, people, you know, Christians and Muslims can't get along, Hindus and Muslims can't get along, and so on and so forth, right? In Southeast Asia, we get along. That's amazing. So we are actually, you know, just as you know, the United States used to be, and still is in many ways, a shining city on the hill, right? Southeast Asia is a beacon also, because it's teaching the world how different cultures can collaborate. I mean, one of my criticisms I make of the European Union is that it's been around for so long, it could not admit Turkey as a Muslim country into the European Union. We in ASEAN, we can admit anybody, which is amazing. So if you want to create, at the end of the day, a more inclusive world order that can live with very different civilizations and live together in peace, the one civilizational laboratory that teaches you how to do this is the ASEAN Civilizational Laboratory.
Thank you so much. There's a question way in the back.
Professor Mahbubani, my name is David from PayPal, and I'm the head of public policy and government relations. So I concur with your assessment of the importance of ASEAN to Singapore. And equally important, I think, is the rise of China and, you know, its position here and its presence here and its importance to Singapore's future growth. And you mentioned the potential US-China contestation. I'm particularly interested in your assessment of the current 4G leaders of Singapore and how they deal with this, you know, this tightrope, so to speak, between China and US, and what do you think in light of recent developments, has the 4G leadership performed well in, you know, holding its ground or demonstrating to China that it can indeed deal with both parties in the most appropriate manner going forward? Thank you.
You're not trying to get me into trouble, right? No, okay, I'm very happy to speak about the 4G leaders, because one of the surprising things about Singapore, I mean, if you read my memoirs, by the way, I grew up in a very different Singapore, okay? When I was born, I was born a British subject, but Singapore was a British colony. Singapore was very poor. At the age of 6, when I went to school, I was put in a special feeding program, went to the principal's office, 1 pail of milk, 1 ladle, 12 boys drinking from the same ladle, improving our immunity. And, you know, that was the Singapore I grew up with, okay? By the way, I should let you know that I'm no longer undernourished. I'm now overnourished. But that was the Singapore, which was desperate and had no hope. Now Singapore has gone to the completely opposite side, and it has been clearly one of the most successful countries in the world. And the big question you're asking is, can Singapore continue being very successful? And I can tell you, as I look ahead for Singapore, I'm very optimistic for the future of Singapore. Because whether countries succeed or fail, it's not just due to leaders alone. It is an important part of the story, certainly. But it's also about the culture and values that you embed into the society. And there's some values that the founding generation of Singapore leaders, especially Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam. And by the way, these three men were, I call them geniuses. They were geopolitical geniuses, certainly geniuses in the way they managed public policy too. And that's why I wrote my memoirs, Hsien-Hsien, to give Singaporeans a better feel of these great minds. So the values and the institutional practices that they've embedded in Singapore are very strong, very strong. And that's why we have a very high-performing civil service, as you know. And all our other institutions, the people are filled on a meritocratic basis. So now Singapore as a system is so much stronger, right? And so the 4G leaders, therefore, can take advantage of this and carry it forward. And I cannot say that I know Lawrence Wong reasonably well. He's come to my house for dinner when he was a civil servant. He went to the same school as I did, one of Singapore's best schools called Tanjong Katong Technical School, which most Singaporeans haven't heard of, by the way. He, I think, understands very well that all his predecessors did remarkable job in constantly moving Singapore up. And that's his responsibility now, to keep moving Singapore up. But he also understands the institutional bench strength that Singapore has. And I'm sure many of you have dealt, for example, with the Economic Development Board, EDB. It's by far the best investment promotion agency in the world. How does Singapore, small Singapore, get 62%? Is that what Taimur said, of American investment? How? Institutional bench strength. So that is going to be a major asset. And at the end of the day, the last point I'm going to make here is that, I always say that, the 19th century was the European century, London was the capital, 20th century, American century, New York was the capital. The 21st century will be the Asian century. And the city that's a natural capital for the Asian century is Singapore, because the only city in Asia where the four major civilizational strains, Chinese civilizational strain, Indian civilizational strain, Islamic civilizational strain, Western civilizational strains coexist in harmony, that's in Singapore. That's a huge asset we have. So people will come to Singapore if they're looking for where they want to go to find the center of the Asian century.
Well, that was a beautiful close. Yes, definitely a round of applause for Professor Mahbubani. We have come to the end of our session. Thank you so much for sharing your stories. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And as a fellow Asian, I want to thank you for the conclusion of your book as well, because you said that you wrote the book to encourage greater self-confidence amongst fellow Asians. And I think we did get a bit more confident with your encouragement today. Thank you so much for being with us.